Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that's both fascinating and a little bit unsettling.
Mm.
Lies and deception.
Oh, yeah. It's something we all encounter in our daily lives, but in the business world, the stakes can be much higher.
Right. We'll be looking at excerpts from an article called Signs of Deception, How to Detect Lies in the Moment, Predict Them in Advance, and Uncover the Truth.
So think of this as your cheat sheet for navigating those tricky situations where the truth might be, well, a little slippery.
Exactly. Especially at work, right?
Hmm.
Because whether we're hiring new team members, negotiating deals, or just trying to understand what's really going on in a meeting, being able to spot those subtle signs of deception can be a real game changer.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because we often focus on catching those blatant lies, the outright fabrications.
Yeah.
But what about those more subtle deceptions, the hidden meanings, the things left unsaid?
Ooh, you're talking about those let's do coffee sometime invitations that never actually materialize.
Exactly. The article calls this implicature.
Implicature, yeah.
And honestly, I think it's something we encounter all the time in the business world, whether it's during negotiations, in job descriptions, or even in performance reviews.
It's that unspoken subtext, right? The message behind the message. And becoming attuned to that can give you a real advantage in the business world. Like, are you really just grabbing coffee, or are you trying to pick my brain for information? Is this job description truly accurate? Or are they glossing over some of the less desirable aspects of the role?
Right. It's all about reading between the lines.
Okay, so how do we get better at recognizing those subtle cues? Because let's be honest, sometimes it feels like a guessing game.
Well, the article offers some helpful frameworks. One is to consider the philosophy behind lying. It suggests that every lie, regardless of its size or intent, aims to change something.
Change something. Okay,
It could be the liar's perception of themselves, or it could be the actual reality of a situation.
I see. So even those seemingly harmless white lies are still an attempt to shape the narrative in some way.
Precisely. And, in a business context, those stakes are obviously much higher. We're talking about trust, reputation, potentially big financial decisions.
Right. Decisions that can make or break a company.
Exactly. And that's where understanding those motives for lying becomes so crucial. Are they trying to avoid a negative consequence, maybe protect themselves or someone else?
Or are they trying to gain something unfairly or even project a certain image that doesn't quite match reality?
All of those and more. It can be a complex mix of factors, and sometimes, to be honest, even the liar themselves might not fully understand what's driving their behavior.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. It's like those subconscious biases we sometimes have where we don't even realize they're influencing our decisions. But as someone trying to make informed decisions, especially in business, it's crucial to try and untangle those motives.
Absolutely, especially when you're building a team, considering a major partnership, or making those big strategic bets.
Because misreading those motives can lead to some pretty disastrous outcomes. Okay, so let's dive into some practical tips. The article mentions some common signs of dishonesty. Are these like those telltale tells that poker players look for? Like if someone scratches their nose, they're definitely bluffing.
Well, they can be, but it's important not to oversimplify things. What might be a red flag in one situation could be perfectly normal in another. Context is everything.
Right, okay.
But the article does list several signs that can be helpful indicators, especially in a business setting. Things like avoiding direct answers, being overly evasive, or suddenly losing that coherence when explaining something.
So it's like they're trying to dance around the truth without actually saying anything concrete.
Exactly. Or sometimes they might go overboard with detail, almost as if they're trying to bury the lie under a mountain of information.
Oh, that's interesting. That's like that saying, the lady doth protest too much. Too much detail can be a sign that something's off. What about body language? Does that play a role too?
Absolutely. Now, you don't want to become a human lie detector based solely on body language, but it is important to pay attention to those nonverbal cues. Things like excessive self-soothing gestures, sudden freezing up, or inconsistencies between what someone is saying and how their body is reacting.
Gotcha. So their words are saying one thing, but their body language is telling a different story.
Precisely. And those mismatches can be incredibly revealing, especially in a high-stakes negotiation or when you're interviewing someone for a crucial role. It's like, do their words and their demeanor line up?
Okay, that makes total sense. But I imagine there are people out there who are really good at masking those signs. Those smooth talkers who can charm their way out of anything. Are there any strategies for dealing with those well, let's call them master deceivers.
Absolutely. The article suggests some really effective approaches that I think are particularly useful in professional settings where you need to maintain a certain level of diplomacy, even when you suspect that someone might be being less than truthful.
Okay, I'm all ears. Diplomacy is key, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to start accusing people without solid evidence. So what are those pro tips for navigating those situations?
One strategy is to focus on asking open-ended questions. Questions that encourage the person to elaborate on their story. This can often reveal inconsistencies or contradictions, all without you having to directly accuse them of lying.
So it's like giving them enough rope to maybe tangle themselves up in their own web of deception.
Exactly. And another really crucial strategy is to set a non-confrontational tone. Remember, the goal is to uncover the truth, not to put someone on the defensive.
Right.
Creating a safe space for open communication can be far more effective than an accusatory approach, especially in a workplace setting.
I see your point. Because even if someone is lying, immediately accusing them might just shut down the conversation completely. What about those what-if scenarios? The article mentioned those as a tactic. How do those work?
What-if scenarios are, they're kind of a brilliant way to gently challenge someone's narrative, without directly calling them a liar.
Okay, so it's subtle. Give me an example.
For instance, if someone claims they couldn't meet a deadline because of a technical issue, you might ask, what if the technical issue hadn't occurred? Would you have been able to meet the deadline then?
Oh, I like that. It's not accusatory, but it forces them to think critically about their own explanation and maybe reveal whether it holds up under scrutiny.
Right. It encourages them to consider alternative scenarios and see if their story still makes sense.
That's a really clever tactic. Now, I'm curious about those individuals who are, well, let's just say, more prone to deception than others. The article mentions pathological lying. How does that differ from those everyday white lies we all tell?
Oh, pathological lying is a whole different ballgame. These individuals aren't just telling the occasional white lie to smooth things over or avoid a minor inconvenience. They weave these elaborate fabrications, often seemingly believing their own stories.
Wow, that's fascinating and a little bit scary, to be honest. How do you even begin to spot someone like that, especially in a professional context? Are there any telltale signs?
Well, it's important to remember that we can't diagnose someone based on a few interactions. But what's interesting is that research has shown that the brains of pathological liars are actually wired differently. They have less gray matter and more white matter in the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, that's the area responsible for planning, complex behavior, decision-making, right?
Exactly.
So it's almost like their brains are built for storytelling.
Oh.
Even if the stories aren't true.
Precisely. And their motivations for lying can be quite different from those of a typical liar. Often it's about seeking attention, validation, or even trying to strengthen social bonds through these fantastical tales.
That's really insightful. And honestly, it makes you think twice about the importance of thorough vetting during the hiring process. Imagine bringing someone like that onto your team. The potential for disruption and damage is huge.
Oh, absolutely. While you can't screen for every personality quirk, being aware of the signs of pathological lying and understanding the potential impact on team dynamics is crucial, especially for leadership roles where trust is paramount.
Right, because it's not just about spotting the lie itself. It's about understanding the underlying psychology and the potential consequences for the entire organization. It's a big picture issue.
Absolutely. And if you do encounter someone exhibiting those signs, it's important to proceed with caution and perhaps even seek professional advice on how to best manage the situation.
That's a great point. Sometimes you need to bring in the experts to navigate those really complex interpersonal dynamics. Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something that's always intrigued me, the why behind lying. The article categorizes it into four main motives: avoidance, protection, gain, and identity. It's pretty comprehensive.
Yes, those are helpful frameworks for understanding the drivers of deception. Let's unpack those a bit more, especially in the context of professional settings.
Perfect. Let's start with avoidance. That one seems pretty straightforward, lying to get out of trouble or dodge responsibility.
Exactly. Think of the employee who lies about not finishing a report because they were, procrastinating. They're trying to avoid those negative consequences of their actions.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. Now, what about protection? Is that about shielding oneself or others from some kind of harm?
Exactly. It could be a manager covering up a team member's mistake to protect them from disciplinary action, or it could be a colleague lying to a client to avoid jeopardizing a business deal. The key here is that the lie is perceived as a way to prevent some form of harm, whether it's emotional, reputational, or financial.
That's interesting. So it's not always about malice or ill intent. Sometimes it's a misguided attempt to protect someone or something they care about, though that doesn't necessarily make it okay, of course.
Right. But even when motivated by good intentions, those protective lies can still have negative consequences, especially in a professional setting where transparency and accountability are so important.
Okay, that's a good point. Now let's talk about gain. That seems like the most classic motive for lying. Getting something you want, whether it's a promotion, a bonus, a bigger office, a bigger slice of the pie.
Exactly. Think about the job candidate who exaggerates their qualifications on their resume to land that dream job, or the salesperson who misrepresents a product's features to close a deal. The driving force here is personal gain, often at the expense of others.
Yeah, it's that age-old temptation to cut corners or bend the rules to get ahead, even if it means sacrificing your integrity along the way.
Unfortunately, yes. And that's where things get ethically murky because those game-motivated lies can create a very slippery slope, eroding trust, and ultimately harming the entire organization.
Absolutely. It's like that whole fake it till you make it mentality.
Yeah.
But what happens when the faking is exposed? The damage can be really hard to repair.
Right. And it can be particularly challenging in a team setting where trust is essential for collaboration and success.
Now, the last motive, identity. This one seems a bit more complex. What's that about?
Identity-driven lies are all about crafting a certain image, a persona that we want others to see. It ties into our need for validation, acceptance, and belonging.
So it's not just about material gain. It's about shaping how others perceive us, even if that perception doesn't quite match reality.
Exactly. Think about the employee who constantly boasts about their accomplishments or downplays their struggles.
To appear more competent or successful.
Right. They're trying to project this image of, effortless achievement.
It's like that pressure to project an image of perfection, especially in a competitive work environment.
Exactly. And while a certain amount of self-promotion is normal, even necessary in the business world, when it crosses the line into deception, it can really damage relationships and undermine trust.
It's like building your career on a foundation of sand. Eventually, that truth will come out, and the consequences can be pretty devastating.
Right. And that's why understanding these different motives for lying is so crucial. It allows us to see beyond the surface-level deception and address the deeper issues at play, whether it's insecurity, fear of failure, or a misguided sense of loyalty.
It's about peeling back those layers and getting to the heart of what's really going on. And that can be tough, especially in a fast-paced work environment where we're often focused on just getting things done.
It absolutely can be. But taking the time to understand those underlying motives can ultimately save you a lot of headaches down the road.
That's a really good point. It's about playing the long game, right?
Yeah.
Building those strong foundations of trust and authenticity.
Exactly. And that's where true leadership comes in. It's about creating a workplace culture where honesty and integrity are valued above all else, where people feel safe to admit their mistakes, and where success is built on authenticity rather than deception.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And one that I think a lot of leaders need to hear. Because it's easy to get caught up in that bottom line mentality and forget about the human element. But without trust, you can't have a truly successful team or organization.
Absolutely. It's the glue that holds everything together.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on something that's particularly relevant to our listeners who are in leadership positions. How do we as leaders effectively respond to lies when we encounter them within our teams? Because it's not always as simple as just calling someone out on their dishonesty, is it?
You're absolutely right. Responding to lies effectively requires a nuanced approach, especially in a leadership role. It's about finding the right balance between holding people accountable and creating a space where they feel safe, to be honest.
Okay, this is really interesting. I'm eager to hear more about this. What are some specific strategies that leaders can use to address those tricky situations?
Well, first and foremost, it's crucial to remember that not every lie requires a full-blown confrontation.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes the best approach is simply to observe, gather more information, and see if a pattern of deception emerges.
So being discerning, not jumping to conclusions based on a single instance of potential dishonesty.
Exactly. Give people the benefit of the doubt, but stay vigilant. Now, if you do decide that a conversation is necessary, there are a few key principles to keep in mind. One is to create that safe space for open and honest communication.
Okay.
Start by framing the conversation in a way that focuses on understanding rather than accusing.
So instead of saying, I think you're lying, you might say something like, I'm a little confused about this situation. Can you help me understand what happened?
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from blame to understanding. And remember, it's also crucial to separate the behavior from the person. You can address the dishonesty without attacking their character.
That's a really important distinction, right? Because even when someone has made a mistake, it's important to treat them with respect and dignity. You're addressing the issue, not devaluing the person.
Absolutely. And another key principle is to focus on the impact of the lie rather than getting bogged down in the nitty-gritty details of what happened.
So instead of getting caught up in the he said, she said of the situation, you focus on the consequences of the dishonesty.
Precisely. For example, you might say something like, when trust is broken, it can really damage team morale and productivity. How do we work together to rebuild that trust?
Oh, that's a great approach. It shifts the conversation from blame to problem solving, and it emphasizes the importance of accountability and shared responsibility.
Exactly. And finally, remember that leading by example is paramount. If you want to create a culture of honesty and integrity within your team, you need to embody those values yourself.
It's about walking the talk, not just talking the talk. Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. Be transparent in your communication, admit when you've made a mistake, and hold yourself accountable for your actions. That's how you build a team where honesty is not just expected, it's ingrained in the very fabric of the culture.
Okay, I'm really liking these practical tips, and they're definitely things that our listeners can start implementing right away within their own teams.
Absolutely. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to explore when it comes to deception, especially in the context of business and leadership.
That's right, we've still got a lot of ground to cover. So stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive, where we'll be delving even deeper into this fascinating and often challenging world of lies and deception.
So we were talking about the importance of leaders setting a good example when it comes to honesty.
Yeah, it's all about building that culture of trust, right? Where people feel safe to be honest even when, they've messed up. Because let's face it, everyone makes mistakes. It's how we handle those mistakes that really defines us, both as individuals and as leaders.
Exactly. The real test of character is how we respond when things go wrong. Do we try to sweep those mistakes under the rug, or do we own up to them, learn from them, and use them as opportunities for growth?
That's a tough one though, right? Especially in a workplace where there's so much pressure to perform and succeed. It can feel really risky to admit vulnerability, like you're exposing yourself to potential judgment or criticism.
Oh, absolutely. Vulnerability can be scary. But the article makes a really interesting point about how transparency, even when it's uncomfortable, can actually strengthen trust.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Unpack that for me. How does being open about our weaknesses make us more trustworthy?
Well, it shows that we're not trying to project this image of perfection, right? We're being authentic, and that can be incredibly disarming, particularly in a leadership position.
It's like that saying, people don't trust perfect, they trust human.
Exactly. And that human element is so important in building strong teams, because when people feel like they can be themselves, flaws and all, they're more likely to be engaged, productive, and loyal.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about creating an environment where people feel seen and accepted for who they are, not just for their performance metrics or their ability to hit those targets.
Right. And that kind of environment is much more resilient to deception, because when there's that foundation of trust and authenticity, those little white lies and manipulative tactics have less room to take root.
Okay, I'm really liking this approach. It's not just about spotting lies. It's about creating a culture where lying simply isn't necessary, where people feel safe and supported enough to tell the truth.
Exactly. And that's a much more sustainable solution in the long run. Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to touch on a concept that's closely related to lying, and that's manipulation.
Okay.
While not all manipulation involves outright falsehoods, it often uses deception and, sneaky tactics to influence people's behavior.
Okay, this sounds pretty Machiavellian. Are we talking about those psychological mind games that people play?
Sometimes, yes, but manipulation can also be much more subtle, like using flattery or guilt trips or playing the victim to get someone to do something that they wouldn't normally do.
So trying to bypass someone's rational decision-making process and appeal to their emotions instead.
Exactly. And it's important to recognize that manipulation can be just as damaging as outright lying. because it undermines trust and creates an imbalance of power in relationships. And that can be incredibly toxic in a team setting.
So how do we protect ourselves from being manipulated, especially in a business context where there are often high stakes involved? I mean, it's one thing to recognize it in our personal lives, but in a professional setting, those lines can get really blurry.
Right. Well, one strategy is simply to be aware of the common tactics that manipulators use. Flattery, guilt trips, playing the victim, creating a sense of urgency. Those are all classic manipulation techniques.
It's like having a mental checklist of red flags to watch out for.
Exactly. And if you sense that someone is trying to manipulate you, the best defense is to set boundaries and assert yourself.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to say no or to challenge their tactics.
It's about standing your ground and not letting them steamroll you. Because I imagine once a manipulator realizes that their tactics work, they're likely to keep using them.
Oh, absolutely. They'll keep pushing those buttons until they find one that gets a reaction.
And it can become this vicious cycle of manipulation and resentment. So setting those boundaries early on is crucial. And remembering that you always have the right to walk away from a situation that feels manipulative or uncomfortable. You don't have to engage in those power games.
Exactly. It's about protecting your own well-being and not letting yourself be exploited. And that brings us back to that idea of building trust, because in a workplace where trust is strong, those manipulative tactics are less likely to be effective.
Right, because people feel secure and respected. They don't need to resort to those kinds of tactics to get their needs met.
Absolutely. When people feel valued and appreciated, they're much less likely to be swayed by those sneaky attempts to influence their behavior.
Okay, so let's talk more about that trust-building process. Because in a world where it seems like everyone's trying to get ahead, often at the expense of others, how do we create that kind of culture where trust can actually thrive? I mean, it feels like a real uphill battle sometimes.
That's a great question, and it's one that a lot of leaders are grappling with, especially in today's hyper-competitive business world. I think one key is to focus on building authentic relationships, relationships that are based on mutual respect and shared values, not just transactional interactions.
So going beyond those superficial exchanges and making a genuine effort to connect with people on a human level, because at the end of the day, we're all just people trying to do our best, right?
Exactly. And it takes time and effort. It's about being consistent in your actions, following through on your commitments, and being transparent in your communication.
It's about demonstrating trustworthiness through your behavior, not just through your words.
Right. And it's also about being vulnerable yourself as a leader, sharing your own weaknesses, admitting when you've made a mistake. That can actually build trust because it shows that you're human and that you're not trying to present this perfect facade.
That's a really interesting point. It's counterintuitive, but admitting our flaws can actually make us more trustworthy.
Exactly. It shows that we're not afraid to be authentic and that we're not trying to hide anything.
And that authenticity is so valuable in today's world where people are craving genuine connections. They can spot a fake a mile away.
Absolutely. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the impact of deception on teams and organizations as a whole. I know we've touched on this a bit already, but I think it's worth diving a little deeper.
Okay, I'm ready to go deeper. What are some of the specific ways that lying can damage a team's dynamics and ultimately their performance?
Well, one of the most obvious ways is that it erodes trust. When team members don't trust each other, they're less likely to collaborate effectively, share information openly, or support each other's ideas.
Right, it's like that foundation of trust crumbles and the whole team structure starts to wobble.
Exactly. And when trust is broken, it can be incredibly difficult to rebuild. It takes time, effort, and a willingness from all parties to really repair that damage.
And sometimes that damage is irreparable, right? It's like a vase that's been shattered. You can try to glue it back together, but it will never be quite the same. There will always be those cracks.
That's a great analogy. Now, beyond trust, lying can also create a culture of fear and suspicion within a team.
So instead of feeling safe and supported, team members start to feel like they're walking on eggshells, constantly worried about being lied to or betrayed by their colleagues.
Exactly. And that kind of environment is incredibly toxic and unproductive. It stifles creativity, innovation, and risk-taking, which are essential for any team to truly thrive.
So instead of focusing on achieving those common goals and supporting each other, team members become more concerned with self-preservation and protecting their own interests.
Exactly. It's like the team becomes fragmented, with everyone looking out for themselves instead of working together as a cohesive unit.
And that's a recipe for disaster in any business setting. Okay, so we've talked about the impact on teams, but what about the impact of deception on leadership?
Well, a leader's credibility and effectiveness are deeply rooted in their trustworthiness. If a leader is caught lying, it can be incredibly damaging to their reputation and their ability to inspire and motivate others.
Right. It's like that saying, people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad bosses.
Yeah,
And a boss who is seen as untrustworthy is definitely a bad boss.
absolutely. And it's not just about outright lies either. A leader who is perceived as evasive, manipulative, or dishonest can quickly lose the respect and trust of their team.
Because those behaviors create this sense of uncertainty and unease. Like, can we really rely on this person? Can we trust them to have our best interests at heart? And when those doubts creep in, it's hard to be fully engaged and committed to the team's goals.
Exactly. So it's crucial for leaders to be incredibly mindful of their own behavior and to model honesty and integrity in all of their interactions, not just with their team, but with everyone they encounter in a professional setting.
It's about setting the tone for the entire organization, right? If the leader is truthful and transparent, it creates this ripple effect. It builds a culture where those values are valued and reinforced.
Exactly. And it's not just about setting an example, it's also about creating systems and structures that promote ethical behavior.
So things like clear codes of conduct, whistleblower policies, robust ethics training programs, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Those kinds of measures can help to deter dishonesty and create a culture of accountability, where people feel comfortable speaking up if they witness unethical behavior.
It's about creating a safety net, right? So that people don't feel like they have to choose between their own integrity and their job security.
Right. And it's important to remember that building a culture of ethics is an ongoing process, not a one-time event. It requires constant vigilance, reinforcement, and a willingness to address those ethical lapses when they occur.
It's about making ethical behavior a core value of the organization, not just a box to check off on a compliance form.
Exactly. Now let's bring this conversation back to the individual level for a moment. We've talked a lot about how to spot deception in others. But what about our own tendencies to lie or manipulate? I mean, we've all done it to some extent, right?
Oh, that's a really good point. We've all told those little white lies or stretched the truth at some point. It's part of being human. But how do we become more aware of our own blind spots and make sure we're not crossing any ethical lines? Because it's easy to justify those little deceptions to ourselves.
Right. It's that slippery slope we talked about earlier. Well, one strategy is to be brutally honest with ourselves about our motivations. Why are we tempted to lie or manipulate in a particular situation? What are we hoping to gain? What are we afraid of losing? It's about really getting to the root of our behavior and understanding the underlying reasons for our actions.
It's like holding up a mirror to ourselves and saying, okay, what's really going on here?
Exactly. And once we understand our motivations, we can start to develop healthier coping mechanisms and more ethical ways of achieving our goals.
It's about finding those alternative routes that don't involve deception or manipulation.
Right. And it's also important to develop our emotional intelligence.
So becoming more aware of our own emotions and how they might influence our behavior. Because emotions can be powerful drivers, especially when we're not fully conscious of them.
Exactly. For example, if we're feeling insecure or threatened, we might be more likely to lie or manipulate to protect our ego.
It's like those defense mechanisms that kick in when we feel vulnerable.
Right. But if we can learn to recognize those emotions and manage them in healthy ways, we can reduce our reliance on deception as a coping mechanism.
So it's about developing that self-awareness and emotional resilience, being able to handle those tough emotions without resorting to those unhealthy behaviors.
Absolutely. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. We're all works in progress, and we're all going to make mistakes along the way. The key is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to be the best, most ethical versions of ourselves.
It's about being kind to ourselves while still holding ourselves to high standards, and recognizing that personal growth is a lifelong pursuit.
Well said. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but there's one more fascinating aspect of deception that I want to explore before we wrap up. It's the power of self-deception.
Ooh, okay. We've touched on this a bit earlier, but it's such a complex and fascinating topic. It's like this hidden world within our own minds. It's both intriguing and a little bit scary.
Exactly. And it's something that we all engage in to some degree, whether we're aware of it or not.
So why do we lie to ourselves? What are the psychological mechanisms at play?
Well, there are a few key reasons. One is that it can help us to maintain a positive self-image and protect our ego.
It's like those rose-colored glasses we talked about earlier. We filter out the negative information and focus on the positive to make ourselves feel better.
Exactly. And another reason is that it can help us to reduce anxiety and cope with difficult emotions. Instead of confronting a painful truth, we might convince ourselves that it's not that bad or that we're not really to blame.
Right. It's like we're trying to shield ourselves from those uncomfortable feelings.
Exactly. And sometimes self-deception can even motivate us to achieve our goals.
How so?
Well, if we believe that we're capable of achieving something, even if the odds are stacked against us, we might be more likely to put in the effort and persevere through those challenges.
So it's like that self-belief can be a powerful driving force, even if it's based on a slightly distorted reality.
Exactly. But there's a fine line between healthy self-belief and delusional thinking.
Right. And that's where self-deception can become problematic. It can lead us to make poor decisions, take unnecessary risks, and even harm ourselves or others.
Absolutely. So it's incredibly important to be aware of our own tendencies for self-deception and to develop strategies for challenging our own assumptions and biases.
It's like becoming our own internal lie detector.
Exactly. And it's not easy. It requires a lot of self-awareness, honesty, and a willingness to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But the rewards are worth it.
Because breaking free from self-deception can lead to greater self-understanding, personal growth, and more fulfilling relationships.
Absolutely. It's a journey worth taking, and one that has a lot of relevance in the workplace, particularly when making decisions about hiring and building teams. Those decisions often involve assessing someone's character, their trustworthiness, their potential for growth. And if we're not even aware of our own biases and blind spots, how can we accurately evaluate those qualities in others?
That's a great point, because we're all bringing our own baggage to those interactions,
Yeah.
right? Our own experiences, our own assumptions. And if we're not aware of those, we can easily misinterpret someone's behavior or misjudge their character.
Exactly. Self-awareness is the foundation of effective leadership. If we can't be honest with ourselves, how can we expect honesty from others?
That's a really powerful thought, and I think it's a perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll be exploring some concrete strategies for building that culture of trust and integrity within our teams and organizations. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been exploring this whole world of lies and deception, and I have to say, it's made me think about leadership in a whole new light, like the weight of responsibility that comes with being in a position of authority.
It really gets to the heart of what it means to be an effective leader, doesn't it? Because at its core, leadership is about trust. It's about inspiring people to follow you, to believe in your vision, and to work together towards a common goal. And honestly, you can't achieve any of that without a foundation of honesty and integrity.
Right. I mean, you can't expect people to follow you if they're constantly second-guessing your motives or wondering if you're being straight with them.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to shift our focus to some practical strategies for building that culture of trust and integrity within our teams and organizations, because it's not something that just happens magically, right? It requires a conscious effort, a real commitment from the top down.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give us those actionable steps. Where do we even begin?
Well, it starts with recognizing that trust is a two-way street. It's not just about demanding honesty from others. It's about being trustworthy ourselves as leaders.
It's about walking the talk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And that means being transparent in our communication, admitting when we've made a mistake, and holding ourselves accountable for our actions. Because, people are much more likely to be honest when they see that honesty is valued and rewarded, not punished or swept under the rug.
Right. It creates this sense of safety, like, okay, I can speak up here, I can be honest without fear of repercussion.
Precisely. It's about creating that safe space where people feel comfortable sharing their ideas, concerns, even their mistakes.
Which is easier said than done in a lot of workplaces, right? There's often this culture of blame and shame where mistakes are seen as failures rather than opportunities for growth.
Absolutely. And that's where a real shift in mindset is needed. Instead of viewing mistakes as something to be avoided at all costs, we need to see them as valuable learning experiences.
So fostering a culture of psychological safety where people feel supported, not judged, when they admit they've messed up.
Exactly. Because when people are afraid to make mistakes, they're more likely to hide them, which can lead to bigger problems down the road.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Transparency even when it's uncomfortable, is ultimately the healthiest approach.
I completely agree. Now, beyond setting a good example as leaders, there are also some structural things we can do to promote honesty and integrity within our organizations. Things that kind of solidify those values in a more concrete way.
Go ahead. Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, one is to establish clear codes of conduct that outline the expected ethical behavior for everyone in the organization, not just for the leadership team, but for every single employee.
Right. It's like setting the ground rules, making it crystal clear what's acceptable and what's not.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these codes of conduct need to be more than just words on paper. They need to be actively communicated, reinforced, and enforced.
So it's not enough to just have the policy. You have to actually live it every day, make it part of the company culture.
Right. And another important step is to create safe channels for reporting unethical behavior.
Okay.
This could include things like whistleblower hotlines, anonymous reporting systems, or even just having an open door policy where employees feel comfortable coming to their manager with concerns.
It's about making it easy for people to speak up when they see something wrong without fear of retaliation. Because that can be a huge barrier, especially in a hierarchical organization.
Absolutely. People need to know that they'll be protected if they come forward with sensitive information. Because often, the people who are in the best position to spot unethical behavior are those who are closest to the action.
That makes sense. They're the ones who see the day-to-day operations, the behind-the-scenes dealings. They might notice those subtle red flags that someone higher up might miss.
Right. And when those individuals feel empowered to speak up, it can help to prevent small problems from escalating into major crises.
It's like that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly. And finally, don't underestimate the power of training and education.
So providing employees with the knowledge and skills they need to navigate those ethical gray areas.
Precisely. This could include training on things like conflict resolution, ethical decision-making, recognizing and responding to deception. Basically, giving them the tools they need to make the right choices, even when faced with those really difficult situations.
It's about equipping people to be ethical leaders, no matter what their role is within the organization.
Exactly. And it's not just a one-time training session either. It's about creating this culture of continuous learning and development where ethical behavior is always top of mind.
It's about making integrity a core competency, not just a nice to have.
Absolutely. Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but I hope you found it valuable.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on deception and the crucial importance of building trust in any organization.
That's wonderful to hear. Because ultimately, the goal of this deep dive wasn't just to give you information, it was to spark a conversation, challenge some assumptions, and empower you to create more ethical and fulfilling workplaces. Places where people feel valued, respected, and inspired to do their best work.
And I think we've accomplished that. To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful, engaging, and maybe even a little bit transformative. It's been a real pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring these ideas, keep asking those tough questions, and keep striving to build a world where trust and integrity prevail.
Beautifully said. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay true to yourselves.